Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Noam Unger. I am Interactions Vice President for Development Policy, Advocacy, and Learning. Thank you for joining us today to discuss how the crisis in Ukraine is fueling global food insecurity. During this session, we request that participants stay on mute and use the raised hand function or chat to ask questions once we get to that discussion point in the meeting. The war in Ukraine has created a massive and deteriorating food security challenge for that region and for food security globally. It has caused a spike in the global price of wheat, up to its highest level since 2008, when the world had its last severe global food price crisis, one with many substantial ripple effects, as many of us remember. Russia and Ukraine export 29% of the world's wheat, almost 1/3 of the global market's wheat supply. It is unclear if Ukraine will be able to harvest existing crops, plant new ones, or sustain livestock production as the conflict continues. As insecurity persists and both local and national supply chains are disrupted, people are likely to fall deeper into emergency levels of hunger and malnutrition. Countries like Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, and Yemen depend on wheat from this region and will be significantly impacted by this crisis. But the effects are even more widespread than those crisis countries alone. This could drive at least 47 million people in 81 countries to emergency or catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity. Currently, nearly 21 million children face starvation. As all of you are well aware, sufficient access to nutritional food is crucial for children and young people as they move through their developmental stages. As co-chairs of the House Hunger Caucus, Congressman McGovern and Congresswoman Walorski lead efforts to end food insecurity and support healthier, more resilient communities by introducing bipartisan bills that support food security in healthy communities in the US and around the world. And through continued leadership and support of international programs like the McGovern-Dole Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, and Food for Peace, which provides humanitarian aid to families, women, and children worldwide. The NGO community appreciates the House Hunger Caucus's leadership in efforts to address urgent global food needs. For this session, Congressman McGovern and Congresswoman Walorski will provide opening remarks, followed by speakers from 4 NGOs, and we will close with a Q&A portion for the audience to ask questions of our NGO panelists. Now, I am pleased to welcome you, Congressman McGovern, and to turn it over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Noam, for that kind introduction. And along with my co-chair, Congresswoman Jackie Walorski, I want to wish everybody a good morning. I want to welcome everyone to this timely and important briefing on how the war in Ukraine is affecting the food security of the Ukrainian people and food security worldwide. I want to thank the co-chairs of Interactions Food Security, Nutrition, and Agriculture Working Group, especially the staff of CARE, World Vision, and Catholic Relief Services for helping pull together today's briefing. I want to thank Martin Schultz with Congresswoman Walorski and Shelby Luce and Cindy Buell on my staff for coordinating the House Hunger Caucus and this briefing. You know, like everyone, each day I wake up and then go to sleep with images of the devastation of the war in Ukraine. And like you, my focus on the horrors and crisis of Ukraine in no way distracts or diminishes my engagement on other humanitarian crises where millions of people endure the nightmare of violence, conflict, food insecurity, disease, and starvation. Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, and Afghanistan, just to name a few. But this morning, we are focused on Ukraine to better understand the extent of the hunger and starvation crisis inside Ukraine and the effect this war in particular is having on food security globally, especially in Africa and the Middle East. Now, I'm not sure how many of us knew that Ukraine is one of the world's breadbaskets, let alone grasping how the swift cutoff of its wheat exports would affect the rest of the world. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, global food prices were already higher than in the past 10 years. This was driven by severe weather events and natural disasters due to climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, all of which led to disruption of food systems and supply chains. As a result, food prices have been rising around the world. With the sudden disruption of Ukrainian food exports, the price of food has skyrocketed in regions of the world where millions already live in precarious conditions. So today's panelists will describe in more detail how this blow to global food supplies is affecting the lives and livelihoods of tens of millions of people. And I hope that they might also share how we can use the hard lessons we are learning from this war and from the difficult times we are living in to think outside the box, to imagine how we might transform our food systems so that they are more resilient, flexible, diverse, and resistant to similar shocks in the future. Wars, conflict, and violence are rarely just a local matter. They ripple across a country, across regions, continents, and even the world. They can't be understood by statistics, graphs, and charts. They have a human face, like the desperate faces we've been seeing from Ukraine. They haunt us. But there is also a global face, which too often is invisible. The faces of families not knowing how or whether they can find food for the next meal. The faces of children going to bed hungry or becoming malnourished. The silence of an empty marketplace because the cost of food is out of reach. These realities leave emotional, physical, and mental scars that can linger a lifetime. And sadly, they can fuel the next round of violence, the next wave of killing, the next war. So I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to share their expertise with us this morning, and I look forward to the discussion. All the best. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Congressman. We really appreciate your remarks and your leadership on these issues. And I would also like to welcome Congresswoman Walorski for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to all of you experts that are here talking about this today. As always, it's a privilege for me to join with my fellow co-chair of the Hunger Caucus, Congressman McGovern. Jim, it's good to see you this morning as well, to address timely issues and to collaborate on solutions to end hunger in America and across the world. As Putin continues to wage a deadly and unprovoked war on Ukraine, today's discussion is a critical opportunity to consider the conflict's consequences for both food production and inflation. This isn't the first time the world has faced these questions. Today, however, the world is experiencing a perfect storm of circumstances that could prolong these current challenges. From global food supply bottlenecks to workforce shortages and skyrocketing inflation, we're seeing troubling indicators, and many of us fear the worst is yet to come. Not only is the war of Ukraine disrupting food production in Europe's breadbasket region, but it's also creating a refugee crisis as well. As millions of Ukrainians are forced to flee Putin's horrific invasion, the Western world is tasked with how to feed them and prevent further suffering. Additionally, we must consider how the war in Ukraine will impact food insecurity in the rest of the world. In recent weeks, I've spoken with officials from both Poland and Romania about this refugee challenge. While I was serving as a missionary in Romania decades ago, after the fall of the Soviet Union, I experienced firsthand that developing strategic partnerships and local networks can serve refugees and meet tangible needs. Our international partners are eager to work with us to address food insecurity among Ukrainians. Here's the bottom line. All of us know that safe, secure, and resilient supply chains are a good portion of the answer. Strengthening our supply chain, starting in the field with ag producers, it is the first step. This is a difficult time for farmers. As fuel and fertilizer prices continue to rise, they're just beginning to feel the consequences of inflation. Especially as we brace for potential food shortages in the near future, the ag community needs our support now more than ever. Additionally, the war in Ukraine has laid bare the importance of equipping and modernizing local agricultural commodities across the world so that countries can better handle global commodity shocks. Given our current reality, I look forward to hearing from our expert panelists and working with all of you to find common sense ways to address food insecurity. Thank you again so much for taking the time and the initiative to start this conversation. Thank you. I'm grateful for our partnerships and ask that you keep in touch with us so that we can work together. We're all committed to our shared mission of ending hunger, uplifting communities, and saving lives. So thank you for all of you, and I yield back as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, and you thanked our community for the initiative, but the initiative is really one that we sense is truly shared, and we deeply appreciate the congressional leadership that you and Congressman McGovern have demonstrated and continue to demonstrate on these issues. We couldn't do what we do in terms of trying to educate and influence others in Congress about the critical importance of these issues without the leadership of the caucus. So thank you so much. And you mentioned the technical expertise that exists across our panelists. And I'd now like to turn to our panelists for their remarks on this situation. And I'll begin with Chase Sova. Chase is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research at World Food Program USA and an affiliate of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Chase, over to you to begin this part of the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, Noam, for the introduction, and thanks, folks, for having me here today. My name is Chase Sova. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research at the World Food Program USA. I want to thank Congressman McGovern, Congresswoman Walorski, and really the entire House Hunger Caucus for your leadership on this issue. You guys, I think, have been really tireless champions for the cause of global hunger. And frankly, I can't think of a more important moment for champions in this space. Noam, here's sort of my big takeaway today. We are not scared enough about the global hunger crisis that is emanating out from the Ukraine crisis right now. I think folks in this community, I think folks on this call in particular, are pretty well aware of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, pretty well aware of what's happening to global food prices. We're getting some good headlines in mainstream media, but I don't think we're fully grasping the extent of the devastation and the hunger crisis that is happening right now and that is going to happen over the next 6 to 12 months. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of secondary impacts. And then I also want to just make a couple remarks about how this is a different moment than it was a decade and a half ago in 2007 and 2008, and that the conditions are a little bit different right now. So I think we've drawn a lot of comparisons there. It's just worth sort of teasing that out. And I hope that provides the context for some of our other speakers that come in afterwards and get a little more granular on this. But let's talk through what we're seeing in Ukraine. Really, it is the speed at which this crisis has accelerated that is really shocking and staggering. Right, we've got at least 4 million people who have been displaced from the country, seeking refuge somewhere else. We've got 7 million internally displaced. Those sorts of levels of displacement typically take months or years to transpire in other conflicts. We've seen this happen over the course of days and weeks in Ukraine, right? In the country right now, food systems are falling apart. We've got critical infrastructure like roads and bridges, of course, that have been destroyed. Airports we've seen bombed. These critical commercial transportation hubs and pathways have been slowed down or eliminated entirely. In encircled and besieged places, we're seeing, of course, that supplies of food, fuel, and water are running out. And right now, as sort of latest math that we've seen and numbers that we've seen coming out of the World Food Program, is that we're thinking about 30% of the country right now in Ukraine, folks still inside the country, are really concerned about finding enough food to eat. They're worried about their safety. They're worried about having fuel for transportation and heating, and they're worried about food in sort of that order. And so we're really seeing a deteriorating situation in Ukraine. In terms just quickly of WFP response, and I think we're going to hear this from the other INGOs in this call, but WFP has reached about 1.3 million people in the country already. We're scaling up response to try to reach 6 million people over the next 3 months. We'll continue that sort of support to refugees who are crossing borders, especially in the west of Ukraine. We are currently pre-positioning a huge amount of commodities in warehouses across the country and in neighboring countries, about 40,000 metric tons of wheat flour, split peas, other bulk commodities. Already, we've seen about 650 metric tons of wheat pushed through bakeries to produce bread for millions of people in the eastern part of the country. And then in the western part of the country, we're seeing the sort of those displacement flows. We're providing some cash assistance there and testing that out in local markets where those markets are still functioning. So what I think is really important to know here is that, it's WFP's job. It's the other folks on this call, everybody who's tuning in today, the expertise and the folks who are calling in, these people are responsible for replacing a broken commercial food supply chain inside of Ukraine, and they have to do it in just a matter of weeks. And so it really is a monumental task. So let's talk a little bit, and I know you've already hinted at this in your briefing. We've heard this from both Representative McGovern and Walorski, but this is not going to be an isolated incident, right? We've have a war right now in one of the world's great breadbaskets. It is not a coincidence that Ukraine's flag depicts this beautiful blue sky over a yellow field of wheat, right? These are major exporters of wheat and corn. The Middle East and North Africa region, of course, are going to be really devastated by those high wheat prices that we've been seeing. Lebanon is importing about half of its wheat prior to the conflict from Ukraine. For Yemen, that is close to 25%. In Tunisia, it's a little over 40%. Now that those ports are shut down in Ukraine, now that some of those commodities are stranded, of course, food prices are doing exactly what you would expect them to do with that constriction of supply. And they're going up, and they're going up fast, right? We've seen wheat go up, price of wheat in export markets go up by about 25%. We've seen maize exports prices go up by about 20% over the last month and a half. And so this is really a big challenge. And as you mentioned, we're just not sure how much acreage in the coming year that Ukrainian farmers are going to be able to get in the ground. Right now, also across the U.S., winter wheat conditions are in just about their worst shape than we've seen in 20 years. So we're not exactly sure what global food supplies of wheat are going to look like in the coming 6 to 12 months. Right now, this is a price crisis. It could eventually, if the conditions are right, turn into a supply problem. Really quickly, before I sort of yield back, Noam, I want to talk a little bit about implications for global hunger of all of this. If we sort of back up to 2019, what we saw in 2019 was about 150 million people who were facing what we call crisis levels of hunger or acute hunger. These are people suffering some sort of shock event in their life and need emergency intervention to save their lives. That number rose very quickly over the past year in 2020 and 2021 to about 283 million people. We thought that at the beginning of this year, as the COVID pandemic began to slow, that those numbers would start heading in the right direction again. Instead, what we're seeing is that WFP is estimating that if this conflict continues in Ukraine unabated, then we will see an additional 47 million people thrust into that crisis level of hunger. That will bring our total to 323 million. That is a new record. Of course, it's a record on top of a record on top of a record, and it's for all the wrong reasons. What we're seeing within WFP operations is that we used to procure about 50% of our wheat from Ukraine. The year prior was almost 1 million metric tons of food coming out of Ukraine that WFP purchased for its various operations around the world. That, of course, we're having to go, some we can still purchase in Ukraine, but we're having to go to different markets in many cases to be able to procure that in other places for emergencies in other places. We're seeing container costs rise fourfold since 2019 to about $4,000 a container. We're seeing shipping prices up. We're seeing fuel prices up, food prices up. All of this means that WFP is having to spend about $70 or $71 million more every month to reach the same number of people, right? You add that up, and that's going to be close to $1 billion this year just to get back to neutral, just to get back to the sort of space that we were in coming into this crisis. One last thing, and then I'll yield back. I think the lot of comparisons to 2008 and 2007 and 2008 and the global food price crisis, and I think that's warranted, right? Prices are about at that level, but here's the difference, right? 10 years ago, we didn't have a war in Syria. We didn't have a war in Yemen. We didn't have conflict in Northeast Nigeria We did not have conflict in Ethiopia, and we most certainly did not have COVID-19, right? So we talk a lot about food price crisis right now, but I think that we need to be talking a little bit more about a food accessibility crisis, because COVID-19 disrupted so many livelihoods. It put inflationary price pressures up on currencies and food in many countries where WFP is operating. If you are already spending 50% or 75% of your household budget on food, any increase in price or a decrease in your household earnings are going to really impact the food security in your families. And this is just creates a very different context than we saw a couple of years ago. So today we're talking conflict, COVID, climate, and costs, the sort of 4 C's of hunger. And those things are blending with the sort of 3 F words, right? Food, fuel, and fertilizer costs. And if we do nothing, we'll probably be talking about a 4th F word, which is famine. So let me yield back on that, and we can hear from some of our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Chase, for that very insightful analysis. To continue the discussion, I'd like to turn to Justus Liku, who is a director for Humanitarian Response with Care. He offers more than a decade of experience in humanitarian work, and Justus has designed and managed various food security programs in the Horn of Africa, Middle East, and North Africa, and Asia. So Justus, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Justus Liku, and I'm a director of Humanitarian Response at CARE. CARE is an international humanitarian NGO whose mission is to save lives, defeat poverty, and achieve social justice. I'm joining you today to speak about the effects of the conflict in Ukraine on food security in the Middle East and North Africa region, and particularly in Yemen, and the work CARE is doing in the region to address this crisis. Even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the food security situation in low-income countries of the MENA region was dire, and protracted crises have led to high levels of humanitarian need. More than 60% of the children in the Middle East and North Africa do not eat sufficiently diversified diets, and fewer than 1 in 4 met the minimum acceptable dietary standard. Both Ukraine and Russia serve as global bread baskets, providing great quantities of wheat and other crops to the MENA region. More than 50% of the cereals in MENA are imported from Russia and Ukraine, including food insecure countries such as Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. As grain supplies and stockpiles decline, the Russia-Ukraine war is likely to push prices up further, sending hunger to unprecedented levels. We expect that Yemen will be one of those countries hard hit by the food security crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. I will now speak a bit about the current situation in Yemen and the work CARE is doing to alleviate food security impacts because of the Ukraine conflict. Yemen has been experiencing a conflict since 2014, as we all know. The conflict has led to tremendous humanitarian suffering, with the UN estimating nearly 70% of the population requires humanitarian assistance. Many Yemeni households are already at the edge of famine and are experiencing acute malnutrition because of the convergence of different drivers of acute food insecurity, such as conflict, the increasing prices, and on top of COVID, which has been there for the last few years. Currently, 17.4 million people will experience elevated levels of acute food insecurity through March 2022, with this number estimated to increase to around 19 million, which is about 60% of the assessed population by the end of 2022. Currently, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Analysis Report, which was done in March, estimates that 1,000 people are in catastrophe and this number is expected to rise to 161,000 by end of June. An estimated 2.2 million children aged 6 to 59 months and 1.3 pregnant and lactating women are acutely malnourished and need urgent treatment. It is important to recognize that the estimates I'm giving you here were released before the Ukraine-Russia conflict and relate to a situation where wheat supplies were not yet disrupted. Therefore, Yemenis could face far greater food insecurity than we anticipated. Even before the war, over 90% of Yemenis households depended on markets to access their main foods, especially wheat flour. Markets, in addition to humanitarian food assistance, remain the primary food source for most Yemenis. So any disruption of the markets will have an outsized effect on food security situation in Yemen. Yemen imports about 64% of its wheat supplies from Russia and Ukraine, either as direct imports or re-exports through the other MENA countries. With the Ukraine-Russia conflict resulting to reduce the supply and subsequent price increase, more families will be pushed to destitution and likely to eventually lead to widespread famine across the country. We are currently witnessing a state of panic in Yemen, with many households who are able pushing to purchase flour and other essential food items. This is all taking place at a time when the World Food Programme confirms it will need to cut rations for 8 million out of the 13 million people they support in Yemen, and warning that even more cuts are possible in the future. Already, CARE aid to suspend a critical livelihood program is supported by WFP due to unavailability of funds. Amidst these challenges, CARE continues to respond to acute food insecurity in Yemen. CARE has refined its targeting to reach the most vulnerable households, including those with pregnant lactating women, children under 5, people with disabilities or chronic health conditions, and the elderly. We are providing them with food assistance, cash, social safety net programs to prevent the rise of malnutrition rates. As malnutrition is multifaceted, we are working to provide programming that combines services including food, water, sanitation, hygiene, health, and nutrition for the most vulnerable communities. Finally, CARE has scaled up its advocacy efforts to appeal to donors in the time where global focus and attention is drawn to the current humanitarian crisis unfolding in Ukraine, and asking not to turn back to the situation in Yemen. The recent pledging conference for Yemen saw only a third of funding raised for what is needed to avert the humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, CARE would like to emphasize to the US Congress and particularly the members of the House Hunger Caucus that it is critical the international community come together, commit and support the Yemenis people once again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel, and I look forward to answering any questions that may come up. Over to you, Bart.
Thank you so much, Justus, and for providing that level of detail on, especially on the dire situation in Yemen, which was dire even, as you say, before this significant shock. So thank you for speaking to that. I'd now like to bring in Dr. Joseph Kamara. Dr. Kamara is the East Africa Regional Director for Humanitarian and Emergency Affairs with World Vision, and he's previously worked in different countries and regions across Africa, Asia, and Australia. And his research mainly covers disasters and disaster resilience, public health, and the rights of young people. Dr. Kamara, please. Just checking to see if Dr. Kamara is still on or if we had a connectivity challenge. What we'll do is I'll actually bring in, if you don't mind, I'll bring in our next speaker and we'll just change up the order. because we seem to have a connection challenge. What I'll do is I'd like to welcome Mohamed Takoy, who is the country director for Action Against Hunger in Sierra Leone. He has worked in the humanitarian and development space for 20 years with experience leading programs across East and West Africa. Mohamed, please, we'd like to bring you in, and then we'll circle back and see if we can connect to Dr. Kamara again. Please, Mohamed.
Thank you very much, Norm, and thank you so much, everyone. And I'm very pleased to join the discussion today and contribute our perspective from Sierra Leone and West Africa. Action Against Hunger is an international humanitarian organization working in 50 countries, and we are greatly concerned about the increasing levels of conflict and food insecurity around the world. We know that hunger is a cause and a consequence of conflict, and we have seen that firsthand in Sierra Leone, where we are still struggling from recovering from a war that lasted over a decade and into this century. The situation in Sierra Leone was already very precarious due to the impact of Ebola disease outbreak in 2014 and 2015 that claimed many lives and destroyed systems and services. And then COVID-19 pandemic that caused food supply disruption. 2/3 of the people in Sierra Leone are food insecure, and 1 out of 3 children under the age of 5 years suffer from chronic malnutrition, which in many cases is life-threatening. Together with their partners, we are reaching many of the most vulnerable communities, but the needs were rising even before the war in Ukraine. Currently, 1.2 million people are facing crisis and emergency food insecurity, and that number is expected to increase to 1.6 million by July, according to the recent reports. At the scale of West Africa, 27 million people are currently experiencing food insecurity, and that number is estimated to reach at 8 million by end of June. That will be the worst food crisis in a decade. We have been working in Sierra Leone for over 30 years, strengthening food and health systems and services with a focus on sustainability and resilience. We have seen amazing progress rebuilding even in the face of many challenges, including Ebola and other catastrophic disasters like flooding. Now, in Sierra Leone, fuel prices have already risen sharply by 80% in the last few weeks. The cost of basic food commodities have increased between 30% to 50%. There has been a tension in the public and the spots of demonstration as a result of increasing cost of living. Agriculture is the main livelihood of the people here in Sierra Leone, and it employs up to 70% of the people, mainly the rural communities. It also contributes 60% of the national GDP. The country relies heavily on external agricultural inputs, mainly fertilizers, seeds. With the increasing prices of this, the local production will be jeopardized, and the trend seems to be worrying. Thankfully, programming supporting resiliency at the community level is buffering some impact so far. Locally produced food is still available to feed communities in some cases, and these are the benefits of investing in community food production system and agriculture. However, this progress is fragile, and this investment must be protected to make stronger resilience and development programming. Despite significant progress over the past decade in Sierra Leone, this progress will be reversed without continuing necessary investment. Investments which are at risk because of increasing cost of business and shrinking pots of development or financing. But challenges in increased fuel costs go beyond transport, delivery of food and goods. Healthcare systems and clinics running on generators are already directly impacted, affecting all aspects of life for most of the vulnerable when the clinics and the hospitals are not able to operate fully. Sadly, our example from Sierra Leone and the consequence of the Russia-Ukraine war are already visible and go far beyond Sierra Leone as well as West Africa. After the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on trade flows, this war once again illustrates the fragility of our global food systems. Right now, the world's attention is on helping the people of Ukraine, and rightly so, but we cannot lose sight of the ongoing life-threatening crisis elsewhere around the world. We must recognize that this war in Ukraine is exacerbating ongoing challenges. Shocks are coming from all directions and compounding each other, creating a dire situation for the world's most vulnerable. Urgent humanitarian aid that meets the immediate needs and avoids the predicted worst-case scenarios must be a priority, and a stronger development programming to avoid not only backsliding on progress made in communities, but also to mitigate the risk of major crisis both humanitarian and political, looming in Africa because of this war. I thank you for this opportunity to share from Action Against Hunger. Back to you, Norm.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. Very much appreciate that lens on the challenges of a setting where the world's most vulnerable situation is exacerbated by the crisis in Ukraine. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Kamara, as I mentioned. He is the East Africa Regional Director for Humanitarian and Emergency Affairs with World Vision. Dr. Kamara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson, members of Congress, esteemed panelists, humanitarian fraternity, and all concerned. East Africa is reeling from a severe food crisis that has made up 31 million people acutely food insecure and pushed over 9.2 million people to the emergency integrated phase classification 4, which means it's an emergency. We also have almost more than 500,000 people who are currently are in catastrophic conditions, which we can say famine-like conditions, or integrated food classification 5, phase 5. In addition, over 1.7 million people are severely acutely malnourished. The food insecurity is caused by quintuple factors beyond the region's coping capacity. The factors are back-to-back drought, the devastating effects of the desert locusts, COVID-19 effects, conflict and fragility, and economic shocks. The back-to-back drought has resulted into 3 consecutive failed cropping seasons. Meteorological predictions suggest that the much anticipated March to May 2022 rain is likely to be insufficient, which will make it the 4th consecutive below average rain season and will aggravate the already dire situation. The drought conditions account for over 40% crop losses and over 8.3 million water insecure people, increased resource-based conflicts, and drought-related displacement of about 2.4 million people across the Horn of Africa. Earlier, environmental conditions were conducive enough to support the breeding of desert locusts that invaded the region and multiplied across the region. Desert locusts are one of the world's oldest destructive migratory pests that move in large swarms and consume food equivalent to what 35,000 people consume a day just for one swarm in the same period. The pests eat anything green until the area is cleared before they migrate to their next destination. The socioeconomic effects of COVID-19 have undermined the resilience of communities in the region. COVID-19 prevention control measures slowed the fight against locusts that destroyed the crops and vegetation. It also COVID-19 control interventions also destroyed jobs, livelihoods, and left people without alternative incomes. As a consequence, many learners have not been able to return to school because some of them decided to stay out of school for too long during lockdown and decided to go out of school. Some became young mothers. We have over 50 million children across Africa who became pregnant during that time. Conflict and fragility has exacerbated the crisis, especially in Ethiopia, parts of northern Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Conflict and fragility has led to almost 11 million internally displaced people and 5 million refugees and asylum seekers within this region. The high burden of IDPs, or internally displaced people, and refugees across the region undermines food security, both at macro, micro, and meso levels. The food security is compounded with economic shocks due to the depreciation of the regional currencies, especially in Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, where inflation is on the rise. Inflation is currently being compounded by the increased oil prices and the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, which supply wheat that is consumed across the region. Does not only supply wheat, but also supplies fertilizers, vegetable, cooking oil, and other products across the region. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted an increase in global oil prices and transportation costs. For example, the price of the barrel of oil has increased to $139, the highest since the global financial crisis of 2008. The high oil prices have led to negative impact on the East African economies, which are vulnerable to deficit balance of payments. As you know, the ideal balance of payment over any country is zero, which implies the monetary payments for imports are equal to the exports. But this status is rarely achieved, especially in this region where the balance of payment is often in deficit. Thus, a slight increase in the global prices of essential commodities such as oil has a rippling effect in the prices of other goods and services. For example, the price of petrol and diesel has increased from about $3.9 a gallon to $4.1 a gallon. That's for petrol, and for diesel from almost $0.3 to $0.50 a gallon, respectively, especially here in Kenya. And without subsidies, the price would have increased to about $4.3 per gallon of petrol and 4.6 per gallon of diesel. The increased oil prices have led to escalation of transport costs that have been passed on to consumers. Evidence suggests that East Africa imports, between 2008 and 2010, East Africa imported about 32% of their wheat from Russia and 12% from Ukraine. About 44% of wheat consumed in this region is imported from both Russia and Ukraine. Over 25 countries in Africa import more than a third of their wheat from these two countries. The combination of high food prices and fuel and macroeconomic adjustments have placed pressure on household incomes and consumption patterns. For example, prices of essential commodities have increased across the region. This implies the proportion of income spent on food has significantly increased, especially among the urban poor who depend on markets for their food, and the rural poor whose agricultural production has been decimated by the prolonged drought. Just recently, I was, I believe, about 2 days ago, I was in a supermarket where I went to buy my usual groceries. And usually it takes me about $50 to have about half a trolley of what I need for the week. And I couldn't believe I spent $99 and the trolley was not half. And it's in the same usual places I shop in. I kept wondering whether they had cheated me and had to sit down and go through my bill receipt item by item to see what it was. And to my surprise, that it was exact. It's just sad that the prices have gone that high. The Russia-Ukraine crisis is aggravating the already precarious situation and is likely to cause civil strife in our region. For example, in Kenya is currently experiencing fuel shortage. Every day now, we can't afford to drive every day because there isn't sufficient gas on the gas stations for all of us. And people have to queue for long hours. I do not know how long this can be sustained before we experience civil strife, because when people are pushed to the wall, against the wall, the only way is survival for the fittest. World Vision has been responding holistically to the crisis in this region, addressing food, water, health, livelihoods, and seeking to create resilience. We believe that even though our regional coping mechanisms have been overwhelmed by the numerous hazards that have happened all around the same time to create the perfect storm that the Congresswoman mentioned earlier on, we believe that we can still manage to do some small steps to make a difference, especially if we continue persistently. Sooner or later, sometime, we will make a difference. Part of that is ensuring we take on community-based approaches that have been tested and tried. For example, we have tried out a method called farmer-managed natural regeneration, where we teach farmers in rural communities to allow their land to fallow and then sprout. Underground trees that were cut for farming sprout again, and then we teach them how to prune them and live with them and then crop with those trees. And because they are indigenous trees that sprout, they survive because they don't need watering. Their survival rates are very high, and they grow up again and revegetate the area. And we have seen this work across regions, across countries. The only challenge we have is how to scale this up to make sure that it's taken up. We believe if we do this, we can push the Sahara Desert back. And we've seen it already begin to happen. I yield my time.
Thank you, Joseph. Really appreciate those insights as well. I'd now like to invite all of our participants to consider questions for our expert panelists. And if you could, please use the raise hand function, and I will monitor and see if there are those who have questions. You may also put something into the chat. And as you do, I will just begin with a question or two of my own. I'll go back actually at first to Mohamed. You had mentioned, you had alluded to how hunger is both a consequence and a cause of conflict around the world, and I'd love for you to explain how that's relevant to Sierra Leone and the current global situation for folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norm, for that question. What we talked today all about how the war in Ukraine is impacting the global food crisis, how it's increasing the cost of food supply in Sierra Leone, in West Africa, in the continent, and the globe. And many factors are linked to the war in Ukraine. We know very well when the income is reduced and the purchasing power of the people are reduced, and the cost of accessing the basic life commodities are increased, tends to be they're not able to achieve what they are supposed to achieve. And that creates, not only inaccessibility to food, but it will create, tension in terms of political tension, insecurity, because you're pushing the people to the wall, as one of the panelists have mentioned. Action Against Hunger has been working with the community in Sierra Leone to work on resilience and development program to strengthen their resilience in food production. But this is very fragile, and investment is also needs to be protected. It is therefore requires all of us, our efforts to ensure the investment is protected, and those who need immediate life are supported, but those who are on the verge are supported with the resilience and development program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohamed. I'm also interested, actually, and people feel free to jump in with questions of your own, but I am interested in something, a connection between something that you mentioned at the start, Chase, and something that Dr. Kamara just mentioned in his remarks too, which is you were identifying that this is we're currently in a price crisis, right? We talked about food prices, but we were also talking about fuel prices, and that we should be thinking of it as a food access crisis, but that in some cases it's not yet a supply crisis. And yet I heard, for example, I heard Justus talking about how rations were already being reduced in the context of Yemen. I heard Dr. Kamara talking about how supplies are already being affected. And I'm wondering, across the panelists, what do you look for? What are the indicators, as bad as things are right now, what are the indicators that you look for to note that things have gotten significantly worse, even from here, in terms of that transition from price crisis to civil strife, or to supply crisis that runs more deeply? Please, any one of you can jump in with an answer to that. I don't know who to begin with.
Well, listen, Noam, I'm happy to start out in answering that. And just a sort of point of clarification, I mean, it is a combination of a supply challenge and a price challenge. These things sort of feed back on each other. As soon as you have a major closing off of supply and locked up commodities like you have in Ukraine and Russia, of course, there are downstream impacts on food importing countries, and this is where you get your shortages. But you also have a huge amount of market speculation that gets baked in to those events. And so it is a combination of supply and price crises. But if you look at global supplies of wheat right now, the export market only counts as a fraction of what is produced. A lot of wheat is grown and consumed in the places where it's grown around the planet. And so it is a complicated relationship, but it is both production and prices. One thing that so a couple things I want to comment on. The other thing is on food price crises and its relationship to instability. And I think this is what you're sort of referencing in your question, is that we've always known for a very long time that when we have conflict, the inevitable outcome of that is going to be food insecurity and hunger. We're seeing that in Ukraine. We've seen that in every major conflict event in the history of humanity. That is just a natural outcome of what happens when people go to war with one another. Hunger is the outcome of that. What we're getting smarter on, I think, and we're learning more about, is this relationship between food prices themselves, or food insecurity, and instability. And that relationship, I think the evidence base is growing for. What we saw in 2007 and saw in 2008 was food price crises that produced riot. It produced instability in about 40 countries. It toppled a government in one part of the world. And so that is really a meaningful relationship that we're learning more about, and that the research is getting better on. We saw that as well in 2011. With food prices and production shops in Eurasia affecting prices across the Middle East, leading to the Arab Spring. We saw major drought conditions in 2011 ahead of the uprising in Syria. So this relationship between food prices or food insecurity and instability, I think is becoming a little bit more robust. One thing I did want to mention too is that I talked about the increase in prices that WFP has in terms of its operational costs, $70 million a month more just to reach the same number of people. Also, if you expand that out, WFP's operational needs this year are going to approach $20 billion, 20 with a B, really huge amount of money. The shortfall expected this year is looking like about 10 billion, half of that. If you go back to 2019, operational needs for WFP only globally were only reaching about $9.8 billion. So our deficit this year is bigger than our entire operational need was just 3 years ago. And what that means is really, really difficult decisions. It means making those 8 million people take ration cuts in Yemen. And quite frankly, it's just it's a math equation that we need to solve for. If you have 44 million people across 38 different countries who are in IPC 4, who are really on the edge of famine. And then you have another 4 million people evacuating Ukraine and 7 million internally displaced, and a program there that's going to cost $500 million or $1 billion just to reach those people. Your math gets very complicated for those existing emergencies. And WFP and some of the folks in this call are having to make really difficult decisions. They have to make decisions about who lives and who dies. The resources are just not there. And so, this is just not something that is isolated to Ukraine. There were so many emergencies around this planet prior to this crisis that we need to keep our eye on the ball. But it also means that it is a zero-sum world out here if there aren't additional resources injected into the humanitarian system, and fast.
Thank you, Chase.
No,
yeah, please jump in, Justus.
No, I just want to add to what Chase has said, and I just want to say one of the complicating factors is here that some of factors of agricultural production are being affected. Here we are talking about fuel, we are talking about fertilizers, and we are talking about seeds. And therefore, what this means is something which is going to affect the supply side as we look forward. So this is something which is going to affect us immediately. It has affected us immediately, and it's likely to continue for some time because there are not seeds to plant. Fuel costs have gone up. So, the machinery, the whatever, it's not available. The fertilizer prices have gone up. What all this is going to result to is increased cost of production and also very high prices in the long term, not only in the short term. So just complementing that, I think it's a problem we have to look from an angle of a very long time, because the supply complications being created are not things you can solve in the short term. It will take us long term. Just wanted to add that.
No, thank you for that, for highlighting the sort of the long tail and the season upon season impact of these disruptions. That's actually very helpful, Justus. Let me pause and see if there are any questions. And Dr. Kamara, if you want to jump in, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add a few on what my colleagues have said. One, both access and availability are an issue in Eastern Africa. One, as I said earlier on, we are facing serious situation where over 31 million people are at the brink of starvation. Now that's a high number. Recently, World Vision team went to northern Kenya. Usually Kenya is one of the large economies in this region. But in northern Kenya, where the crisis is really bad, we visited a few families. In one family, a mother was crying. She had 400 heads of cattle, and she was only remaining with 3. The rest had died. That's just one family. Along the way, we saw many carcasses of livestock and wildlife that had died: zebras, giraffes, buffaloes. But this woman had lost almost the entire herd. You can imagine 400 heads, and she had only 3. Her husband had left home, was living in the bush because he was depressed. And he said he didn't want to see his children suffer, die. And the woman told us that she has to tap her children at night to see if they are still alive. Now, to any parent, that's heartbreaking. Another man, we visited a family where his daughter was going to get married, primary school girl. And when we asked why and what we could do, he said to save the others. If I can marry off this one, it's one less mouth to feed, but we'll have some money from bride price to save the others. And he said, what would you do if in my position? You think I don't love my children? You think I don't have a heart? What would you do? I've lost everything I had. So to me, this brought it very close as a parent to understand that it's just not the statistics, it's people. And they have to make very difficult choices that probably no one wants to make. When it comes to indicators, when you look at the prices of commodities like bread, especially now that we have the wheat is becoming an issue. In this region, we eat a flat bread called chapati for those who have been to this region. That's a staple on almost everyone's table. And once that goes, what about the common person, the casual worker who eats a chapati and goes to work every day? This becomes a very serious issue. Yes, last night I saw a story on Al Jazeera where they were interviewing farmers, and a farmer said she's giving up because she can't afford the price of fertilizers. I hadn't realized that the crisis of fertilizers had already arrived on our shore. We're hearing it in theory, but hearing this woman and others saying we can't make it. I mean, how much money can we get out of it if we go by these prices? There's no way. I just have to leave. So, which is unfortunately plunging us into further on in the abyss.
Thank you thank you for, I mean, this is the strength of this community when it comes together. We are able to actually understand the broader cross-regional global systemic impacts of things and be able to see the statistics. And there were many statistics thrown out in this call that are really stark and very alarming in terms of, you know, the past total budget of WFP versus the current deficit, or the numbers of people on the brink of starvation. But Joseph, your comment is a very important way to end the conversation, which is this is also a community that sees and experiences the human terms, the individual terms, the issues that actually relate to human dignity at the individual and family level and community level around the world, and sees the ripple impacts of things like a conflict in Ukraine on conflicts in other parts of the world and contexts in other parts of the world up close and personal. And we thank the Congressional Hunger Caucus and Congresswoman Walorski and Congressman McGovern and today's speakers for really highlighting these issues. We have recorded today's session, and we will be sharing this conversation with others and continuing the conversation. And I just want to thank everyone for this opportunity for today's discussion. It's really been a very rich discussion and also quite sobering, and it should mobilize all of us to further action. So please join me in thanking our expert panelists and our members of Congress, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.